A very good morning. This morning, we have a live Q&A with Professor Ian Martin Symonds, the Dean of the School of Medicine, who will be answering the very interesting as well as very relevant topics in regards to the programs and how it's offered, particularly during the pandemic. With his vast experience, we welcome Prof. Symonds to give his speech and this talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alexis, and welcome everybody.
Okay, so Prof. Symonds, for this current pandemic, we can see that there are certain concerns from the parents and all that. But before we begin, there's a general questions. For example, could you tell us what courses does the School of Medicine offer at IMU?
Thanks, Alexis. The school's major offering is obviously the MBBS medical program, but in addition to that, it offers an undergraduate degree in psychology and a postgraduate master's degree in counselling. From next year, we are hoping to launch a new master's degree also in clinical psychology. And our students undertaking their MBBS can also do an intercalated Bachelor of Medical Sciences degree, honours degree, as part of their medical studies.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, so following up from that, just a moment. Yeah, could you give us a brief overview of the medical program at IMU, since it is very, very popular?
Okay, thanks. So basically, we offer two pathways in the medical program. One is a domestic medical program that's done entirely in Malaysia, and the other is our partner medical school program, where students do the first half of their course in Malaysia and then transfer to one of our partner schools in the UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and in the future, New Zealand. So the local degree is 5 years or 10 semesters in length, and is made up of two parts. Broadly speaking, a medical sciences phase of 5 semesters, where students learn about the medical sciences that underpin medical practice, the anatomy, physiology, community health, etc. That's mainly based on the campus here at Bukit Jalil, and is largely delivered by small group teaching, where students work through a series of real-life clinical problems that are relevant to medicine and learn about the relevant sciences that support the diagnosis and management of those conditions. They also get some early clinical experience. Right from the first semester, we start teaching about communication and clinical skills. And in the final semester, before they transfer to full-time clinical study, they do placements at hospitals and primary care clinics.
Right.
In the second part of the program, there's another 5 semesters for the domestic pathway students, where they rotate through a series of placements at different hospitals, in different clinical specialities, and also in some family care clinics as well. That's a mixture of simulation-based education and face-to-face teaching, but it's primarily experiential learning by being exposed to seeing and looking after patients, of course. This year, we've actually introduced a new curriculum, which places even greater emphasis on applied skills, small group teaching, and getting early clinical experience. So we've just completed the first semester of those groups of students.
Great. Wow, it sounds like a really comprehensive program and really taking care of the students' training all the way through. Okay, so the thing is, how popular is this course, in the sense that how many students a year are admitted to the program? Because I understand that we have to maintain quality standards as well. So how many students are admitted a year?
So we have 2 intakes a year in February, who start in February and September. And in each of those, we take about 200 students. So it's about 400 students a year, roughly 50-50 split between the partner medical school track and the domestic pathway. So it remains competitive and popular degree to get into. The minimum academic standard required is the equivalent of 3 Bs at A level, or an ATAR in Australia of 80 or more, or an IB score of 30. And in addition, students have to reach a minimum competency in an English language proficiency test to apply.
All right, that's great. And now, the thing is, once the students are have joined the program. What kind of support could be available for them while they're undertaking their degrees in the School of Medicine?
So we recognize obviously that transitioning from school to university is a huge step in any young person's life. And indeed, even within our program, moving from campus-based university life to clinical medicine is a big transition as well, particularly for those students who are going overseas and are going to live somewhere that where they're away from home and they haven't lived before. So we have a range of different supports available for students, both at the university and at the school level throughout the program. Of course, in the first instance, students are encouraged to talk to their lecturers, their supervisors, their posting tutors, the course coordinator or the program director if they're having a particular question mark about an aspect of the course or they're struggling with that. We have in the school executive a dedicated associate dean solely responsible for student welfare and student affairs. But in addition to that, all of our students are assigned a mentor who they remain with for the duration of each phase of the program and whom they meet with at least twice a semester and often more often if necessary if they're struggling. In that they join a group of other students, a small group of other students from different years of the program who can provide support and advice to their more juniors about the program. We have a core of trained counsellors who are available to support the mentors and see individual students who are having personal or health issues or academic issues with the program. And then we have an active buddy system where new students are paired with other senior students to give them an introduction to life at IMU. And recently we've supplemented that by piloting a peer tutor program where more senior students actually provide tuition to groups of junior students. And finally, I mean, IMU is well known for its vibrant student life and the support that the student societies and the student representative councils provide to each other. We have a range of extracurricular activities, student societies, sports activities, and support groups. Perhaps, for example, most notably the Mind Matters group, which is supervised by our Professor of Psychiatry, Professor George, but which is basically student-led and has been very active in supporting students over the course of the last 12 months.
Well, it sounds great. So the basically guiding students and supporting them all the way from entry level all the way to graduation. So particularly in regards to supporting them, we have to address the issue that's we are all facing right now, whereby the last 18 months have actually seen the impact of this global pandemic in every aspect of our normal life. So could you tell us a bit about how COVID, for example, has affected the medical as well as the other degrees, you know, the delivery and what kind of support we can give to students, particularly during this time?
Sure. Well, obviously, I mean, COVID has had a huge impact on all universities, the whole community for that matter, and IMU is no exception to that. We've had to face operating in the restrictions that have been imposed upon us by the Ministry of Higher Education and the NSC. And that has meant periods at which our campus at Bukit Jalil has been closed and where clinical placements have been suspended or significantly restricted. That's also meant that some of our international students who are coming to us from other countries have had difficulty getting here, or in some cases, for example, students at the moment from India and the subcontinent have not been able to get here at all. And conversely, it's also meant that some of our students who were due to go out to partner medical schools, in some cases have not been able to get visas to enter into those countries or have been restricted in doing that. We do also recognize that, you know, many of our staff and students have been separated from family and loved ones for many months now, and that's posed an additional stress on those students as part of that. And we've had to adopt a whole range of new standard operating procedures for the way that we conduct teaching, even when students are on campus or in clinical placement, to ensure their safety, and in things like delivery of assessment and so forth. Where possible, we've tried to focus on delaying things that could be delayed until the situation improves. So in some cases, that's meant that some students' progression points to the next phase of the program have been delayed a bit, but without actually having at any point to pause the whole program.
Mm. All right. So, I mean, the school's definitely doing whatever it can in the current situation, but of course, complying to the requirements of the ministry as well. Is there any possibility, or when would you kind of expect if teaching would ever return to normal? You know, if there's such a word anymore. Do you think there will be any maybe possible long-term changes in the way in which medicine or the Master of Counseling or the psychology program is being taught?
Well, yes, that's very difficult to know, of course, and to some degree, it's outside of any university's control. It will depend on what the National Recovery Plan mandates about restrictions on travel, and in terms of things like university students being on campus. So what I can say is at the moment, we are already doing a phased return to face-to-face teaching for those aspects of the program that can only be delivered face-to-face. So a limited amount of teaching at the Bukit Jalil campus for clinical skills, and a resumption of clinical placements for semesters 6 to 10 in the program. At the moment, that means smaller student numbers than normal, restricting numbers on campus and in clinical placements, and really an increased focus on doing what we can do online still, but also hybrid teaching and learning, with making the most of our state-of-the-art clinical simulation and skills facilities. Now, we're not suggesting that doing simulation is a substitute for real patient experience, but there are certainly aspects of skills that can be taught and rehearsed in a simulation environment, and we have one of the best in Malaysia for doing that. So the other thing that obviously you asked about was, you know, do I think it'll have a long-term impact on that? Well, I mean, the nature of learning how to counsel people and learning how to practice medicine must involve talking to real people and working in real life clinical settings. So in the sense that, do I think medicine would ever be a purely online program, or counseling would be no. I think it will be the case that when we are able to, we would like to try and resume as much of a deep clinical experiential experience for those students as we possibly can. However, I think there are things that we have done in the course of the last 12 months that were perhaps going to happen anyway, which have been vastly accelerated. And by we, I don't just mean IMU, I mean the whole higher education sector. I think the digital technology for delivering teaching, and particularly online distance learning, has progressed out of need leaps and bounds. And I think that is with us to stay in some form or other. For example, I think this will spell the end of the large group lecture format for delivering information, when students can just as easily watch and rehearse such a presentation online at a time of their choosing. I think that we will see that the resources that have been developed during this pandemic for online learning, such as the initiatives like our virtual medical clinic or the virtual patient, will continue to be a valuable supplement for student teaching and learning. So I think it will change the landscape in some ways forever, but I don't anticipate that what we're doing right at this minute will be the way that it will look for students who are, say, enrolling in the program from next year for the whole of their medical degree.
Right, so we're looking at being flexible, but when it comes to the core components and the critical components of a program, we're going to maintain the kind of quality, particularly in regards to, let's say, the doctor-patient or student-patient interactions, to actually have and maintain the hands-on learning as much as possible within safety reasons, of
Exactly.
course. Right. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So, how have, I mean, all this is wonderful from the school side, but how have these changes been communicated to the students, because, and have they actually been involved, getting the feedback and how these changes have been made?
Yeah. Look. As I mentioned before, we have two student representative councils, one based at the campus, one based at our clinical campus. And throughout the course of the last 12 months, our program directors and our associate deans and myself have met with leaders of the Student Representative Council on a regular basis to communicate the changes that we've been proposing to make. And often, there has been a plan and then we've had to revise that plan 4 weeks later and again 2 weeks after that because of the evolving nature of the pandemic. So it's been a pretty full-on process for both us and the students of having to continually adjust milestones and their expectations about what's happening. That has also been a route for us to get feedback from those groups. Each intake has batch representatives. And again, if there are any immediate changes that we need to make, then the information is disseminated through WhatsApp and other methods through the batch reps to those student groups. Now, on top of that, we've also been holding a series of virtual town halls where all students in particular years, often by individual batch, have been invited to attend and where we've presented the latest updates of what's going to happen. And of course, there's written information on our learning management system for students to access or they can contact their mentor or clinical supervisor. In answer to your second question, absolutely. I mean, we have taken note of the feedback that students have given us about the changes, and in many cases we have modified our approach in light of that feedback. So students have been involved in that decision-making process to some extent. For example, when we were forced to redistribute clinical placements a few weeks ago because of restrictions in Symonds, students provided feedback to us that this would cause difficulties with them in terms of transportation costs. So as a result of that, we developed a strategy around providing transport for students to get to those clinical placement sites that we hadn't done before. And likewise, we've modified the way that we've delivered some of our online teaching to take into account student feedback on that.
Right. So students' voices are heard, and we try as best to accommodate whatever their difficulties or challenges that they face. And this is actually a very dynamic situation. As the situation keeps changing, the student will actually continue to give feedback, and we try again. We'll continually have discussions with them. So, right. So that's actually a very good option there.
That's absolutely true, Alexis. And I mean, obviously, there are some things that are beyond our control, that we can't accommodate what we would like for our students and what they would like and the feedback they've given us. So wherever possible, we've tried to sort of say what we can and we can't do and why we can't do it, if that is the case. So at least students understand that there is reasoning behind what we are doing.
Right. So, I mean, we work with whatever we can, but if we have certain limitations due to SOPs or whatever changes that the government implements, we have to acknowledge that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but that brings me to the next question then. As you had mentioned earlier, that the medical program, about 50% of the students actually are transferred to partner schools. So has this meant that students, in a sense, because now we're looking at other governments, right? They have their certain restrictions as well. So has this meant that basically our students have been unable or find it to travel overseas to the partner medical schools to complete their part 2 of the program?
Yeah, it depends a bit on where. So the students who had already gone. So generally speaking, students transfer in either the penultimate year of the Partner Medical Schools program or the year before that. So for the students who had already done a year at the Partner Medical School and were in those countries, they've generally been able to carry on, bearing in mind that in some of those countries, they did pause their own medical programs, including ours, affecting our students last year for a variable number of months. But beyond that, yes, students who were due to transfer this year, for example, by and large, those students who had elected to go to the UK or North America were able to do so. And indeed, our UK partners actually provided a number of additional places. But students who were due to travel to Australia were not able to travel to Australia. And that's because the Australian government imposed restrictions on entry really right from the beginning of last year, starting with Chinese students and then rapidly extending that. Now, what that has meant is for those students who were scheduled to start in Australia last year, they have either been given the option of deferring in the hope of joining the Australian program next year, or they chose to take up places at other partner medical schools in the UK or North America. Whatever happens, we have given a commitment that all students who are enrolled in the PMS track will be offered a place. Whether that's their first preference, that we can't necessarily say. That is true normally anyway. But we will guarantee that everybody gets a place in a partner medical school. It's just a question of when and where, really.
I see. So that's really good that we are following up on a commitment to help students to complete their projects. I mean, sorry, their partner school transfers. But in regards to the placements, in regards to the number of spaces available from our partner universities, has that changed because of the pandemic?
So again, it depends a little bit on where you're talking about. The short answer to that is no. I mean, you've got to bear in mind that we have more than 24 partners across different countries at the moment. And in any given period of time, some universities will leave the scheme and others will join us. So for example, we have regained a partner medical school track in New Zealand, which was due to start next year, but now probably will be the year after because of their visa restrictions. And likely to, we hope, have a couple of new schools available also in the UK. So at any given time, we try to maintain a balance between the number of students we're enrolling and are looking for places, and the number of places plus some extra capacity to allow for flexibility there. I mean, obviously, we don't want to have unfilled places, which, you know, our partner medical schools would then have banked on filling. So we can't have too big a leeway there. But overall, I wouldn't see necessarily that leaving aside the short-term difficulties of specific universities in particular countries, that at the end of this, we'll emerge with fewer places in the PMS track. As a precaution, though, because of the restrictions and the backlog of students waiting to take up the PMS track in Australia at the moment, we have slightly reduced our intake of the PMS track for the first intake of 2022. So we'll be offering 85 instead of the usual 100 places for that entry, and then we'll be reviewing the situation after that.
Right. I mean, understandably so in that sense, but definitely we're doing everything that we can along with our partners to maintain the places as well as help the students complete their degrees. But having said that though, does this mean that maybe some certain students' progressions, especially towards graduation, may be delayed in the process?
So as I mentioned before, what we've done throughout this, even if it's meant switching to online learning entirely, is to continue to teach students throughout. Now, some of the progression points, so where some of the particular semesters have ended, have had to be pushed back by a few weeks. But ultimately, we don't envisage that impacting on which part of which year students would ultimately graduate in, unless they've deferred because they wanted to wait to see if the situation improved for students getting into places like Australia, which obviously might impact ultimately down the line on that. So, I mean, the short answer is that whilst the end and start date, the end dates of some individual semesters might have changed, we've tried as far as possible to get to accommodate that by rescheduling where semester breaks and holidays are and compressing those and so forth. Because obviously we can't have two semester groups overlapping with each other. And in terms of graduation, so the students in semester 10 will still graduate in the same year as we had originally planned for them to do. Generally, students don't go straight into housemanship jobs after graduation, so we don't think it will have any impact on what would have happened to them under normal circumstances in terms of the next part of their medical career.
All right. Okay, in regards, that's a good segue actually. I was just going to ask, in regards to the medical career, and does any of these factors actually affect the employment prospects for students currently?
No, is the short answer to that, I think. Look, as I mentioned, we have, as all medical schools have, worked very closely with the Malaysian Medical Council and the MQA, the Quality Assurance Agency, to ensure that any changes that we are making in the program stay within their requirements for accreditation of that degree. So there is absolutely no suggestion that this will impact on the value or the accreditation or recognition of the IMU medical or other degrees down the track. Students will be able to register for employment in just the same way as they would have done, and the IMU degree itself is recognised by an increasing number of medical councils in other countries overseas at the moment. Now, of course, students who go down the part medical track, they get the degree from the university that they go to, not from IMU, and those degrees are obviously recognised for full registration in their home countries. In terms of other degrees like psychology and counselling and so forth, I would have thought, if anything, and I don't base this on any particular detailed knowledge at the moment, that the need for healthcare professionals, particularly those supporting mental health, is going to go up, if anything. So I do not see that necessarily COVID will impact on employment prospects for those degrees either, except possibly in a positive way. But it certainly won't impact on medicine.
Yes, I can see that. I mean, just looking at the newspapers every day, our current healthcare system is overworked. They need new people, qualified, trained personnel to come in as well. So definitely both from the medical as well as from the psychological and counseling aspects, I think we can definitely help the Malaysians, the healthcare system to help them along the way to deal with the pandemic and the long-term effects as well. Okay, now having said that, I understand that some students are maybe concerned about maybe coming back to campus, or because of the pandemic and current situation, especially with the high rates of infections as well. So what has the school been doing to support students' well-being in particular during the pandemic?
Okay, so yeah, look, I mean, as I mentioned before, obviously this has been a very difficult and stressful time, and at the school level, we've been providing support for students through our mentor system, and at the university level, the university has set aside over 6 million ringgit for supporting students and their families who are encountering hardship as a result of the pandemic. So basically in two funds: fee support, where families, businesses perhaps have been impacted, who can apply for fee remission or fee support, on a case-by-case basis according to need, and a fund that students can apply to from our Student Services Division if they themselves are experiencing individual hardship because of the costs of accommodation, living expenses, internet expenses, and so forth. So on top of that, as I mentioned, we've been running with the Department of Psychology support for mental health for our students. Our counselling services has been there to support students as well. Now, in terms of student safety, obviously, we are continuing to try and deliver as much of the program as we can online, but clearly there is a limit to what we can ultimately do in that space in terms of some aspects of clinical skills teaching in the first part of the program and a lot of the clinical teaching in the second part of the program. So we recognise that some families will potentially be concerned about that and may wish to defer studies until the situation changes. And if they choose to do that, there wouldn't be a financial or an academic penalty for that, although obviously they would then have to drop back to the next cohort, so graduation would be delayed. But for students who are ongoing, our efforts really are focusing around ensuring that we have the safest possible operating processes for students when they're on campus or on clinical placement. So we have adhered to the Ministry of Health guidelines, restricted student numbers to 20% of normal on campus, in mandated double mask wearing whilst on campus, reduced the number of students that are in a group at any given time, expanded and supported RTK testing for students resuming clinical placements. Obviously, emphasise to students the need to stay away if they're feeling unwell. We have a process in place for students who report positive, so those students are supported by us with regular contact and updates to make sure that whilst they are serving out a period of isolation, that they're okay. The other key thing we've been doing is working with the Ministry of Health on facilitating vaccination for our students. So we provided student details to the Ministry of Health so that where there were, even though they were in the younger age group, that vaccination was made available to students, particularly where there were short notice vacancies on vaccination appointments that cropped up at the major vaccination centres. Of that initiative, just under 90% of all of our students have now had at least one dose of the vaccine, and all of our staff who are involved in frontline teaching have as well, have been fully vaccinated. It's really difficult to know, when things are going to change here. We do know that 98% of people who have been vaccinated who get the disease have mild or category 1 or 2 symptoms only in that. I think it seems unlikely that the virus is going to suddenly disappear in the next few weeks. So really, I think the key to this, as it is to the reopening of the community at large, is to ensure comprehensive vaccination coverage and then appropriate operating procedures to minimise the risk of transmission after that for our students, so that they can continue their studies as safely as possible.
All right. Prof. Symonds, thank you so much for all the in-depth information, and you can see that how IMUs and particularly the School of Medicine are really supporting student welfare, student well-being, but also not neglecting anything at all, not cutting any corners in regards to student teaching. Now we would like to move on to some questions from the audience, and this is a question from one of the viewers right now. What is the basis for assigning the partner medical school for the students? For example, do the students actually get to choose their particular partner school? Could you help us enlighten us on that?
Yeah. So students are provided information about each of the partner medical schools, and then towards the end of their preclinical course, they are asked to give indication in order of priority which school they would prefer to go to. There is then a matching process whereby the partner medical schools are supplied with the list of the students who have indicated that they would like to go to that partner medical school. And then there is some input from the partner medical school of which of those students that they would prefer to, that they will take. So that is partly determined on the basis of academic grade during the time that they are with us. And in some cases, some of our partner medical schools take other aspects of student performance, like some of their extracurricular activities and so forth, into account in making their own ranking. So then we have a matching process where we compare student preference to the ranking list of students provided by the partner medical school. About 3/4 of that weighting is determined by the student preference and about 1/4 from the partner medical school. Obviously, this isn't always an exact match. Sometimes more students put a particular school as their first preference than that school has capacity to take places from. And then where possible, we try to give students, to work down their list of preferences in an appropriate way. Now, clearly at the moment, as I mentioned before, with the restrictions on entry into Australia and so forth, then, that process has meant that in some cases, students got their first preference or have had to consider moving to a different country to take up their partner medical school track. What I can say is that all of the schools that we pick as partners, many of them are very long, well-established leading medical schools in their own countries. They're all obviously accredited by their own accrediting body. And that wherever you get a degree from any of these schools, ultimately probably makes very little difference to practicing in that particular country. Yes, there is a matching process which takes student preference into account.
All right, thanks. So obviously, the local students can actually move on to partner medical schools if they choose to do so. But what about international students that join us that they want to transfer to a partner school in another country, but that country may have imposed certain restrictions on these international students because from where they come from originally? Is there such a situation, and what could we do about something in that situation?
So I think it's important to realize that even in normal times, students are not allowed to select a partner medical school in their home country. So they have to go somewhere else. But there is the potential for movement between pathways, but no guarantee of that. Particularly for students who want to take up a partner medical school place. That is only an option if other students drop out of that scheme or decide to switch to a domestic place. We can't guarantee that students will necessarily be able to change to the partner medical school place, because obviously our priority is to accommodate those who selected that pathway from the outset. But yes, there is some possibility of movement in both directions.
All right. There's some questions online here about is there additional requirements if students were to do the IMU pathway compared to transferring to partner schools? Are the requirements a bit different? I mean, do they have to come up with higher grades and all that kind of stuff?
In terms of admission, the major difference is that students have to get a higher English proficiency score. I think that obviously there are a number of tests for that, but the IELTS test, probably the most widely used, students have to get a score, an average score of 7 or more, and 7 in all of the key subcomponents of that in order to take up a partner medical school place. Whereas I believe that's 6.5 for the domestic pathway at the moment. Academic grades are the same. Obviously, students need to maintain a good academic performance throughout their preclinical program, but that's roughly the equivalent of 3 Bs at A level at the moment, or an ATAR of 80. So yes, there are some differences, but not huge in terms of which pathway you elect to go into.
Okay, maybe just one more question because of time. For the rest of the audience, what we can do is that we actually have a continuing. You can actually scan later. I'll actually show you a QR code, and actually you could go on to actually attend our virtual date, which was on till 4 p.m. today. And you can actually post the questions there, because we can direct you to some medical lecturers who will be able to answer your detailed questions, particularly about admissions, certain requirements as well. So Prof. Symonds, just one more question. Have there been any situation where students have selected a partner medical school, but due to placement issues, they have been asked to study locally instead? Yeah, has there ever been such a situation like that?
If obviously, as I said, students can choose to do that, and they may choose to do that for a range of reasons, including financial, for example. There are some circumstances in which some of our partner medical schools require that students complete a Bachelor of Medical Sciences degree before they take up, because they are graduate entry programs. So students have to have got a full degree. And that involves an additional 6 months of study here and a research project. So we have a partner medical school G or graduate track for students going to places like the Australian National University and Warwick. So students will know that's the case from the outset if that's the partner medical school that they are choosing to go to. But in terms of students being compelled to take an alternative of a domestic place, no, we would not do that. Some students have chosen to do that rather than defer taking up their PMS place because of COVID. But if they are still wishing, even though they may have to wait a bit to take that up, we would still find them a PMS place.
All right. Okay, so thank you so much, Prof. Symonds. And I'd just like to inform everyone that we have run out of time for this session. And I would really like to give a big thank you to Prof. Symonds for just being very open, honest, transparent, but also most importantly, giving us the right information in regards to how the School of Medicine is actually managing the whole situation, which is very fluid and ever-changing, but always in touch with students and the feedback in regards to the partner schools, in regards to the governments, and always being in compliance to everything. So that is actually very, very wonderful news, because that way, it actually, I hope it can assure a lot of students and potential parents and students as well that we're doing everything possible, to give your child the best option in regards to the programs that are offered in the School of Medicine. Thank you for all the time that you spent with us this morning. Big thank you to Prof. Symonds as well, and we hope you have a wonderful day. So
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.